everybody. Thanks so much for coming this evening. Such a treat to be in the studio, surrounded by this amazing work, which I've seen develop since the beginning of August. So yeah, amazing to see it finish and hear about it. Tonight it's going to be Emma Fineman in conversation with Saskia Flower. Saskia is Assistant Curator at Tate Britain in London. And Emma, I'm just going to read your biography. So Emma Fineman, from Berkeley, California. In 2018, she received her MA in painting from the Royal College of Art in London. Fineman's works have been selected for several prestigious awards, including the Presidential Fellowship Grant, Anderson Rauch Art Centre, Aspen, as well as the Harley Open Judges Prize, Welbeck Estates, Harley Museum and Foundation, the London Bronze Editions Prize, London Bronze Casting, London. Her works are selected for both the John Wills Painting Prize, Walker Art Gallery, Liverpool, and Bloomberg New Contemporaries, the Liverpool Biennial and South London Galleries. Emma has been granted residencies at the Vermont Studio Centre, Anderson Rauch Art Centre Residency Workshop, Palazzo Monti Residency in Italy, and of course, Porthmeor Studio. So I'm going to hand over to Saskia and Emma, who are going to be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So over to you guys.
Thank you so much. Welcome. Yeah, thank you so much. I found it such a pleasure to be here. For those at the back, do shout if you can't hear me. We are unmiked, but can project. I guess spoiler alert is that Emma and I are pals, and have been for a couple of years now, and have had many conversations about art and painting. So we will try and not be such a rambling mess that we often go into some tangents. But yeah, Emma and I met a couple of years ago, just before you did the last Porthmeor Studios residency. Just after. Just after. So Emma's done this twice now. She spent time down in St Ives in two major stints in your life. So maybe you can start by telling us a bit about your relationship to St Ives and to this residency, and why you wanted to come back, and what you kind of had in your mind.
So I did a residency in 2020, as Saskia said. I had met the wonderful Sam Bassett, who's an incredible Cornish painter who has a wonderful relationship with the Porthmeor Studios. And I was a big fan of his work. I had seen it and did like a presentation on it when I was in my BA. And so I reached out to him, and he had invited us to come and see him in the studio, and he was in Studio 9 at the time. And after that, I was like, this is my dream. And Eleanor Louise Butt was doing a residency in Studio 5, and she was like, come on in, let me show you. And she introduced me to Chris, and the applications were due that week. So I went home, and I was like, I have to do this! And then I was accepted to do the residency, and it was supposed to only be for 3 months. It was for January, February, and March. And then the pandemic hit, and so by March, it was like we're in full lockdown, and most of the other artists who were supposed to come, well, all of them couldn't, and so they kept allowing me to extend and extend. So I ended up being here for 6 months. I got to sit with the lovely Helen and Jean. And it was just incredible, because even though we were in this like really restricted experience, it was like we actually got a chance to meet. I got to meet the other artists who were here, because it was just us, and just the local community for the beginning of it. Obviously things got rammed later, but it was an entirely surreal experience of St. Ives, and I felt really lucky to be able to just there's such a unique history to this place, and the relationship of St. Ives to artists and creating this environment for reprieve, I think is a really interesting one. So artists like Barbara Hepworth leaving, being able to escape the threat of the war, and being in this environment when it felt like, you're constantly hearing about the spread and this sort of global effect of that was really surreal. So that affected a lot of the work that I made at that time. And then it sort of haunts you, the space, after you leave. And for a number of years after that, I guess it's been 4 years since I was here last, and I just could not stop thinking about the idea of creating this chapel and the way that this room specifically feels like one to me, because it's been a space that's been poured over with rituals of artist making for so many years. And so I've kind of just been like fantasizing about it, dreaming about it, started working on things in the studio, these expansive monoprints, and then finally I was in California for a period of time, where I'm from, and I was working in the studio, and I was like, okay, if I don't make this right now, like I'm like choking, it's like it was in my throat.
Yeah.
And so I started on these first 2 panels, and completed those, and that's what I used for my application for the rest of the project. Basically, like, this is the beginning, there's going to be 12 canvases, it's going to be a room, it's about Genesis, this is what I want to do, please, can you let me do this, please? And they wrote back, yes, you can do this, yes. So yeah, that was the process.
But it's not the first time you've done a kind of an immersive project. Obviously this is different, but I've seen in your studio before the kind of she has this amazing wraparound monoprint work that was sort of collaged together with multiple bits of paper, right? So you've been working out the sort of the architecture of an immersive painting for a while. And so you had these 2 panels, and you arrived, and she's done this in 2 months. 2 months is an extraordinary feat. 12 panels. Spoiler alert, I think there is an idea that they might loop around at some point. So they could be displayed in a kind of 4 walls experience, which I think will be amazing to see.
That's essentially the plan, yeah. Like, even though this space was like the most conducive to actually producing the work, the intention was always to create this room with sections of 3. So you have, and that gets into the whole idea of the seasons. So you have 4 walls, each one comprised of 3 panels, which constitute the idea of the season. So then each panel, I guess, would be a month. And the total of the work is a year, essentially, if you think about it in those terms. So it loops. So the process of making it was a constant moving and shifting of where the panels were in space and seeing how they would line up and how they interact with each other and where the seams can be. But obviously the easier way to display it within the context of this space is like this. I was also like, if I have to build a wall there, then that's going to take a whole... No, I'm not doing it.
I don't have the time.
It's too much.
We'll do some painting.
We'll just look at it like this.
Okay, so as you may have heard, the work is called Genesis, and it is engaging with ideas of the seasons, engaging with ideas of cycles and ritual, but there is a central character and there is a sort of narrative. So maybe you can tell everyone a little bit about the people surrounding us.
Yes. So yeah, this is the Genesis project. It feels like it's sort of the first chapter. I was raised Jewish, but I'm very interested in all sorts of mysticism, theology, and especially the ways in which certain symbology exists across cultures, faiths, timelines. I think that is the most interesting thing. But I was really aware that the story of Genesis, which was my Torah portion for my bat mitzvah when I became a woman, which was a strange experience, that it casts Eve and women as being the cause of the fall, and that this moment, this like key moment, which is access to knowledge, you would think is like the greatest gift you could possibly give mankind, is seen as some sort of like catastrophic sin, an act of total failure. And I disagree with that entirely. And I also feel that, as did many of the suffragettes, specifically the ones that wrote the Women's Bible by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, felt that narrative of Eve as sinful has actually been hugely pervasive in all parts of culture and society today. So even if you're not Christian, even if you choose to exist outside of religion, it still has such an effect. And we see that. I see that even in the US, the fact that this might just maybe be our first time having a female president. Maybe, right?
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. So it's an interesting thing, because on the one hand you think of them as these kind of like fables, or that it wouldn't necessarily affect you if you don't ascribe to that religion or that ideology. But basically in this book, in the Women's Bible, they were determined that if a woman's role was written such that she was subservient to men, then her role in society would never change. And so they took it upon themselves to take every bit of text in the Bible that referenced women and reverse the roles, or at least put her at an equal plane to man. And that book is referenced in Judy Chicago's illuminated manuscript, which was also a huge point of inspiration for me. She created her own kind of creation myth story Bible, as it were, that does a similar kind of recasting. And so it starts with this moment of Eve receiving this interaction with the serpent, and then that basically being potentially a cause for this whole awakening, this reminder of who she actually is.
Yeah.
And I find it really fascinating that she's written as this entirely one-dimensional figure, that she's just a plaything for Adam. The other factor that came into play while I was working was Lilith. And Lilith is a figure from Jewish mysticism. She's featured in the book of Isaiah from the latter prophets. So it's not in the Torah, but in a previous or accompanying text. And many rabbinical scholars have completely written her out and have said that she never existed.
And she was Adam's first wife.
She was Adam's first wife. And she was a much more three-dimensional figure. And her whole MO was that she didn't want to lay underneath Adam. She wanted to be seen as equal, and she wanted to even potentially switch those roles and be on top of him, and he refused. And he said, you have to be subservient to me. I will not lay underneath you.
Yeah.
And so she was cast out of Eden. So this sort of retelling is kind of the relationship between Lilith and Eve and their dynamic, and the possibilities of reminding oneself of who you are and what your inner knowledge is, and how that affects a possibility for a change in societal structures and our relationship to the natural rhythms of the world. If that's the project.
I think there's a lot more to the project than that, but yeah. I mean, so we have Eve is behind us, and Lilith is over there. And can you talk us through the move between the seasons as you go around?
So you start with March. I mean, obviously this would shift in terms of, I don't agree with how calendars are written. Anyway.
Well,
obviously to me, the year does not start in January. Thank you very much. That makes no sense. Spring is a start.
Yeah.
So this is March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December, January, February. So those are the months.
Yeah. And we were talking earlier about this idea that perhaps Lilith and Eve are like actually not two people, but two halves of the same person, or that Lilith represents sort of shadow self. And so I wonder if you can speak a bit about your relationship to, like, why this is coming up for you now, why this interest in like mythology, religion, the slippages between our roles as in gender, in identity, and how that relates. Sorry, this is a long question actually.
That's actually
I'm not going to ask you to, yeah. But I mean, I think it would be interesting to share a little bit about why those stories felt important to tell for you, what that role is in your painting practice, because you could paint anything, right? But like why that felt like a reckoning at this particular juncture for you.
I think a reckoning is a really good way of putting it, 100%. I think that my relationship to painting has always been one that exists in this kind of in-between. There's a way that it kind of dances between figuration and abstraction, or gestural drawing versus more sculptural modes of painting. And I'm very much invested in those, as you put them, slippages. I think that there's incredible possibility in the spaces that exist between things. And painting does this phenomenal thing, which is that its gravity is different to how we experience it in our day-to-day lives. You can suspend time and narrative and multiple moments of existence and planes of reality at once. And I find that to be endlessly fascinating. As that relates to my own sort of journey of identity, discovering and allowing my queerness to be more towards the forefront of my lived experience and existence and understanding of myself, and pulling out the shadows of that experience. I think that that's also an act of understanding the in-between.
Yeah.
I think that we obviously live in a very binary society, and it's not just about, I think that there's something that happens when we try and define things or put very restrictive, concrete language on things, where there's a beautiful quote that you read me.
Oh, yeah.
About how you lose the possibility of the thing itself once you restrict it to the limiting words that are used to describe it. And so I think that that's also true for how we understand ourselves and the ways that we and the world around us. And this thing of queerness is also, and fluidity is very much related to questioning. And I see creating these spaces, and I see art making as this wonderful act of conversation. It's a prompt. So you create room in those gaps for people to fill in their own narrative, to stitch in, but you're also providing a prompt of questioning of oneself.
Yeah.
What is your viewpoint? How did you come to those concrete conclusions? And maybe can you question that there could be an alternative perspective to something? In politics especially, everything has become this hyper-politicization of our understanding of the world has meant like, this is what it is, this is what I believe in, and I don't give a fuck what you have to say about it.
Yeah.
And as soon as you admit to identifying as the other team, the opposition, my ears turn off. And I think that that's one of our greatest failures, is not having that openness. And that starts within oneself. It certainly has for me anyway.
That's so beautiful. Yeah, I agree. And I think that the way that you have constructed that within a very physical space is particularly interesting. So maybe you can talk a little bit about like the actual mechanics of this, in terms of, I think at one point you referred to it almost like a theatre set. So maybe it would be great to hear a little bit about like how you physically construct it, how you approach it as an architecture. But also, one of the things I love about this piece is the way that in certain places there's total alignment. You know, you've over the seams of the canvases where they join, there's a kind of it's a breaking point, and then sometimes you're kind of complicating that. Like we have this doorway here, which kind of overlaps the seams of the paintings. So you're, in a technical way, really playing with space and really playing with our perceptions of it. Yeah. And I would love to hear more about that.
I very much am informed by the history of painting. I think that no painter can remove themselves from that context. And within that context is a beautiful relationship of narrative painting to architectural spaces, especially in the context of chapels. And so it's something that's always really fascinated me. But I've also thought a lot about how those environments can be incredibly alienating for many people. And especially with a lot of the language now around being religious and conservative, being liberal and outside of that, then where does one go? Where does my spirit go? Where do I get to experience that sort of transporting relationship to an environment and a sanctuary?
Yeah.
And so the other thing that occurred to me is we spend so much time with our awareness being sucked into these little tiny screens. So the idea of creating an immersive experience for someone and pulling your body into a space that you respond to, that hopefully for even 5 seconds puts you in present time, felt vital to me.
Yeah.
And also every one of my best possible memories that I've ever experienced have been very all-encompassing, you know, whether it's the feeling of like being in water with your friends at sunset, it smelled like this, the sound was that, it's all of those things at once where you're totally in awareness, as opposed to like when I get into the TikTok slog and hours go by and you kind of get out of it like nauseous and like confused and disoriented, but also like I learned so much, so I can't stop doing it. I will definitely do this again tomorrow. But I think that that's why it's really important to have these kinds of environments. So it's less about, I think there is something to be said for being a woman that takes up space. And there's been a lot of resistance to that, and a lot of backlash from that. Being an American that's loud and makes big things.
And this is a big thing.
It is a big thing.
This is a big work.
But it's also like...
I mean, it requires a ladder.
It does require a ladder. It does require a ladder.
There's a real physicality to it that's really impactful to the viewer. And the materiality of it. I think your sensitivity to materiality is extraordinary. And one of the things I love the most about you as a painter. And your commitment to the texture and to the physical experience of the paint, of the wax, of the Hessian makes for a really visceral experience. So maybe you could tell everyone a little bit about some of the different materials that have gone into this, especially that February panel with the which has some paper in it.
Yes. I love letters. I work in caustic, oil, charcoal, resin, acrylic. There's a lot of different things that happen on the surface, and monoprint. And that was my first time. Every time I approach a painting, I usually like to try and add in another element I haven't worked with before in some way, because it just sets me off of my groove. I think that sometimes you can get in this kind of ritualistic habit of making where you go into autopilot and
relying
on certain things, and I think it's important to always be like surprised or responding actively to what you're making. So this was the first time embedding the monoprints, which I usually work on as a separate thing, into the painting itself, and that's happening in that final section. But I think you're absolutely right. Having this variation of how a surface is being received is really important to me. The paintings, all things considered, are quite flat in their depiction of color, these sort of flat blockages of color. And so when you have these different pitches, these hierarchies of mark, it creates a depth with how you enter into the work, or parts of it, certain things that sit and feel and have a certain sensation or a concreteness to them, necessarily so. Whereas other things, there's a beautiful sensation that vine charcoal produces on the surface of anything really, but on canvases for me, this kind of velvety, smoky, dusty, or the way that it sits on the surface of the building and it kind of like catches your throat. I think that there's, because I'm working solely from memory.
Yeah.
Of course, I read a lot, and that goes into the work as well. But it's a sense experience, and that I think using those different materials and the way that they sit on a surface, hopefully you evoke some of that in how you experience it. And then the other thing is that physicality is very different than screens, than the digital space, which we're so absolutely informed by in our contemporary moment. And I feel very invested in painting for the fact that for what it does.
Yeah.
You know, that's why I choose it as a medium to work with. I work in cast bronze and other materials as well because they do something else. But what painting also does is it has this magical way of. One thing that I was told one time that just screwed my brain up forever, and I'm obsessed with it, is that your tongue knows how everything feels.
Oh yeah.
So if you look at any single thing in any part of this room, you're you're like, I know exactly what that feels like, because that's how you experience the world as a baby. And I fucking love that. And so it's there's a reason why something might sit differently on a surface in terms of the things that it evokes potentially.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you're not mapping out these canvases beforehand. Like, I think if I had come in here, I would have assumed that Emma was coming in here and had already sketched out what each panel would look like, or roughly how they would kind of configure. But other than these two, which were made previously, you were it was a really live process. So maybe you can tell people about what your day-to-day experience was, or night to night.
Years ago, I used to stage these elaborate photo shoots and have an idea. We talked about this earlier, but this idea of a mountain climbing approach, where it was like, I see the destination, I just have to get there. And I would make the image and make this collage and then paint it. And the actual life was already dead. It was already dead before I'd even touched a paintbrush. And it was just an act of illustration. So from that point on, I came to understand painting as a conversation and a dance, a call and response. And something that has to be alive the entire time. And so that's why I cannot work from sketches. It's one thing to make, I make a lot of monoprints, preliminary drawings, and that almost feels more like creating this sort of language of symbols that I can then pull, that stay in the back of my mind and then can make their way to the front as I'm working. So that sometimes happens, but in terms of any of the paintings, it's this constant dance of working from an intuitive place, knowing that this just has to, I don't know why, weirdo choice, Emma, but it is what it is, it's coming out. And you do that, and then you respond to it, and you see, kind of where things have to develop and how they have to develop. And I had a conversation with Helen about this, just the difficulty of, okay, I'm trying to be able to talk about the world and queerness and the start of mankind and women's position in society and this crazy bitch Lilith, and I have to do it all in 12 canvases, and even though it's an entire room, it just doesn't feel like enough space to be able to do all of that, and I don't know how I'm going to do it. And you just, every day you come back in and you're like, what is my intuition telling me to do today? How am I going to respond to that today? What is this mark saying? Why does it not sit right? And you just keep hacking away at it until eventually something clicks and you're like, oh, that's why that had to be there. And it really reveals something to you after the process of making it as well. As much as you're informing it with all of these things and trying to throw in the kitchen sink. There's always a reason. And that's the part that's like this really fascinating discovery and feels like therapy, as corny as that is.
So can you point any examples of maybe some things that came out of it, revealed themselves like as a surprise to you? I'm kind of interested in this idea that like you don't like it, that something's a surprise to you is kind of extraordinary given you're its maker,
There's this wonderful video of Philip Guston. I think it was produced by Hauser and Word, and he's talking about working in the studio, and he says that this is a misquoting, but I'm trying my best. When he first enters into the studio to work, it's full of people. You have your dealer and this person and that person, and little by little, everybody leaves the room, and eventually you yourself also leave the room. And that's when you're actually making your work. And I really, really believe in that. When you're too consciously aware, there's a sense of hyper control. And that controlling way of working sometimes prevents the messages from coming through. Your work is trying to tell you something if you let it, I find.
So it's a surrendering process. Yeah.
100%. 100%.
Yeah. And you were working also at strange hours, no?
Yes. Channeling is especially easy when it's done between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. But for me, it's 2 p.m. to like 2:30. But I work at night mostly for that reason. You're kind of in this like weird trance-like state of being. And also, especially being in St. Ives and especially in August, there's so much energy and life happening in the street. And why would I be in here when there's all of this going on? You know, I can't focus on anything. And as soon as the day starts to peter off into night, you have this feeling of calm. Like even right now, later in the evening, where it's like, okay, I can do this. I can start to focus. And then the strangeness happens when it starts to turn, like that 1 a.m. period where it just starts getting really weird and you don't even know what the fuck you did. And then you come back the next day and you're like, Emma, people are gonna send you away. You can't do that. Don't do that. Don't even do that. And you respond to it. And you're like, well, okay, why did I do that?
Yeah.
And how am I gonna work with that? This bed, these.
But there is such a spectral quality to the piece. Like there are these sort of shadowed figures that loom in and out. Or we were talking earlier that if this is Eve, there's a sort of face emerging as if it was Lilith through the yellow. This kind of haunting quality, I think, is very palpable in the work. And I'm particularly interested in the ways that you feel that your environment has shown up in these paintings, and the difference between California and St. Ives, and how those kind of the light, the rhythms, the natural landscapes have kind of seeped through.
100%. I find it really helpful to paint in different environments because they absolutely create an entirely different effect. The heat and the sun and the light in California is so present in this part of the painting. And it's one of the few times that I do paint in daylight. And there's always joy, there's always yellow when I paint in California. The experience of the lichen on the surface of the roofs in St. Ives has just been so captivating to me. And when you're walking, especially in some of the higher points of this environment, you look down and you just see the way that it like glistens. Oh, it's such a magical sensation.
Across all the roofs.
Across all the roofs. And it's alive and it changes. Even now, it's so much warmer than it was when I first got here. But it really affects my perception of this place. And so when I was working on this building section, originally it was like the weirdo time. It was a teal hospital. That's when I was like, Emma, no.
A teal hospital?
It was this really creepy, overbearing, and it was this medical teal that has come up at different times for different reasons. But this time I was like, I do not accept you. We're not doing that today. And so over time, as I continued to work the painting, it just had to be this ochre color, and I was working on it. And then I went outside, and I was like, oh, there it is. And that's why you're here. And so St. Ives feels like it absolutely informed the landscape in this section. But it's the even short memory of it, even if it was from that morning, it's still coming through in a kind of remembered sense. But then again, these sort of red roof buildings come from my childhood, and seeing them over and over and over again in Marin, in the headlands, in San Francisco, that's an ever-present, this kind of Venetian red color is ever-present because it was such a part of something that I experienced over and over and over again.
And I can't help but think of the, it's like the white picket fence imagery, which is so sort of America, surrounding this kind of quite ominous, quite imposing yet skeletal bed frame. Maybe you can tell us a bit about this opposition between the sort of vacant, empty, sort of dense landscape versus this, which feels much washier and harder to much more ineffable, harder to grasp. This sort of repeated motif of the portal, this kind of move into another world, a slip into a different plane.
I see them as like two possible outcomes. So you have this primary moment, and as Eve is reminded of who she really is, of her history, of this knowledge, it's almost like a pulling of a thread that goes back, but also pushes you forward. That's something that I'm kind of obsessed with at the moment. That like, oftentimes, because right now feels like we're at the end of what was the whole history behind us, that it's the last chapter, but I feel so very, very stuck on the idea that this is just the first chapter, it's the very beginning, but that it's very important that we actually go back and we retrace our steps to pull back out all of the narratives, all of the stories, every bit of information that was overlooked because of this one singular patriarchal narrative that we've been told over and over again. But all of this is there. It's not like it's this new idea, this invention that's going to get us into some verdant future. And it will, but it's a history that we need to be reminded of. Yeah. And it's many histories, and it's many stories, and it's many different experiences that have been kind of glossed over for the purposes of control. And what is the outcome when we don't allow access to that knowledge, or a celebration of, or an openness to those other realms, those other portals, those other spaces, third spaces, queer spaces, things that sit beneath the surface of something, things outside of the binary.
Or to sort of paraphrase a bit of Audre Lorde, this idea of like the falsity that the erotic it can only be relegated to the bedroom, and that actually it's when you let it seep into all aspects of your life, that she talks about it like it's a sort of creative well. If anyone has not read the uses of the erotic, it is life-changing stuff. But it was a sort of funny thing between us when we've been chatting about this. This was a few weeks ago, and I had been like, I need you to just read this essay because it's spectacular. And then we talked about this painting. It's like, oh, like we could have not done this talk at all, and I could have just read that essay. Like that is how much this essay is talking about what we're talking about here. And this kind of false idea that the erotic is only about sex, but it's actually about every aspect of our life, and it's about creativity and about and love and joy and spirituality. And when you let it infuse all aspects of your life, it's a way of resisting oppressive systems. And so I kind of, when I see these kind of dichotomies here, there's a spectacular thing of like the doom of like systems that control versus the freedom available when you let go of defined narratives. And
I think as one experiences sitting outside of what has been established as a safe way of operating, this kind of roboticized way of existing within the structures of society, there is fear, and there is this sort of need to code switch and signal, and to be able to, it's the whispers, because if you are to be, and historically as queer people, if you are to be out in the open, there's danger in that. And so a lot of the experience of queerness and of queer desire and of engaging with that is actually these sort of hinting to, speaking about all of it but the thing, not putting the word on the thing. And it's this amazing space for desire to build, and to try and understand everything else instead of just saying, this is the role, this is what you're meant for, this is what you will be, this is how you will act, this is how you will operate within a societal structure. You get to kind of, on the one hand, that secrecy can be terribly painful, to be sort of sitting beneath the surface. And one hopes to be able to be out and to be able to experience the full breadth of their identity openly and honestly in society. But within that secondary space, there's so much questioning that can happen of what else is possible, you know? And that gets into desire, which is so much more than... I think the other part of the quote that's really fascinating to me is this idea of pornography and how that is actually so unsexual. It's this like, there's no sensation. It's a voyeuristic observation of it.
Yeah.
And actually, the sensation of wind on your skin, something that isn't technically a sexual act and isn't meant to be erotic in like a perverse way, is rife with pleasure and joy in a way that actually is deeply fulfilling.
Yeah.
Why deny ourselves access to that? You know, it's not perverse.
And do you think that in making this painting, you have created space for yourself to live more truthfully in that joy?
It's been a reckoning.
Or pain.
Yeah, I think it's been a reckoning.
Yeah.
You know, it almost was like the work was like, the gig is
It's
out.
coming, or it's the train's already left the station.
The train's already left the station. Yeah. Either you accept the realities of who you are and how you wish to exist, or you're stuck in a very dark place. And I refuse.
Well, what's wonderful about this work, and I think will be the last thing we'll say before we open it to the team, is that it feels live still. Like it's complete. You've done the thing, but it still feels so active and dynamic. So maybe you could. Is there anything like what do you see its life now? You know, what are its potentials for further ritual, for further gathering, for further exploration?
This has been the most exciting part. Like in the process of making it, I was reached out to this amazing filmmaker, Camilla Greenwald, and she does these beautiful films with dancers. And so the idea of creating an environment that then could invite in performance, or that then could be a space where you get to engage in ritual, but again, it's outside of the confines of traditional religion. That can be, it's a different kind of space. So for me, that feels like very, very exciting. And also this idea that it's a first chapter, that like potentially in my lifetime, as I experience new things, as life happens, as we see what the fuck happens in November, you know, that a lot of, that there might be other chapters, that maybe this is truly just the beginning of those rooms.
First of many Genesises. It's so beautiful. I'm so proud of you. I guess over to you guys if there's any questions please ask. Or observations.
That was a lot of words.
Maybe I have a question. Maybe to like follow up on the last question, like how you envision that work evolving. Like I was thinking, like how you see it being like presented. Like you really briefly talked at the beginning, like how it would be like maybe a closed space of like this really contained artwork. But maybe have you ever thought about how would you present it if it was kind of an option for you to present all of these panels separated from each other in the way that they would be maybe like presented in one single gallery but like in different like sectioned area in the way that they kind of become their own fragment of the story, or if you think that they would just all have to be together at all times to tell the story that you're telling.
I mean, it would be like, would you dissect a book?
Maybe.
Could be interesting.
Yeah, it's like chapters, and also they all contain their own stories in one panel, but they all kind of become to the bigger picture. And also the way that you described about how you worked on them, like all together, so they all contained elements of like the rest of the work, but they also all become their own very defined panel and defined month, and like this very like unity. Yeah, I'm just curious about how you would like think about presenting them.
It's a potentiality for sure. I think it's something that I am very interested in, though, is this. We have this constant, I think it's because of our relationship to how we read books, this sort of left to right way of seeing something, or in terms of time, as being this kind of linear start here, end here. And the thing that I love about creating a room is this looping, that it's not necessarily that this is the first panel and then you go like this and that's the end.
Yeah.
It's actually a constant back and forth, which is again what I think about in terms of this moment in time, that you're reaching back and looking forward constantly. And so this idea of a loop is incredibly important to me, and it is very much how I perceive time and our experience of it. So it is possible, yes, and it might do something, but it would just be different, and we would miss a very crucial part of that understanding, that it's not necessarily this chapter actually at all. And what is the relationship if you were to loop back to this figure, and are they actually that figure? Are they the same? And how do those things dance between each other?
Thank you.
Yes.
I was thinking along the same lines actually, but because you were talking about architecture and how the paintings reference a chapel. But the problem, I'm a real 3D thinker, and the problem I've got is that you've got to kind of project into the middle of the space to create a loop. So
I've got a plan for
all
that.
the time, imagining it as a sculpture facing outwards in like a ring, and that way you're making the paintings architectural, but you're also putting your version of Genesis kind of out there. So it's kind of like that kind of like you're projecting it into the world and not being insular, and you're not relying on architecture. You're kind of claiming it. It's just an idea.
My
What do you
idea
think
was
about that? Because it's weird that you were thinking sort of a similar thing.
Yeah.
If we are sat here in here, listening to you, but also kind of experiencing it, so it's kind of easy to think and stuff. So, what do you think?
I was thinking Beyonce. I was thinking the concert arena. You know, from the floor up to the middle, and now you're in it. No, I think that's an interesting idea. But then what happens if you now, where's the holding? Where's the womb? Where is the environment to enter into? You lose the presence of what's happening here, which is a bunch of energies in one space, engaging with each other, enclosed. The entering into a body, which is important. But I do like the idea of something radiating out. But that's you in the space. It is a practical, logistical question that I do have to figure out, and I don't think that my Beyonce plan will work.
Built a door.
That's going to be a potential, yeah.
That's the spring with the jump.
It sounded fire in my brain. You know, different kind of energy, kind of like, whoa. But, yeah.
A crane.
Exactly. A slide, like a spiral. It's something to figure out for sure.
Are there any more questions?
Yes.
I'm sitting here and feeling this as an intimate room, and there are many rooms that have been decorated by artists, which are rooms to inhabit. And you've got a bed there, which is a very intimate space. So this is a room where we can be private, we can be ourselves, as you've been saying. You don't need to be who anyone else thinks you are. But it's also, you're also talking about this as like a theatre set for performance, which of course is the opposite of the intimate. Performance is throwing things out there, whatever you feel is there for other people to experience and scrutinise and react to. So I'm just wondering, as I sit here, I'm feeling this space in both those dimensions, and I'm just wondering, for you, how do you feel it?
I love that. I love the way you put that. That is exactly the experience of gender.
Okay, well, that's good to hear.
It's public perception butting up against personal experience.
Oh.
Exactly it.
Thank you all so much.
On that note.
Such a joy.